Imagine standing in the absolute center of the Australian Outback. The air is a thick, shimmering curtain of heat that distorts the horizon into a liquid dance of silver mirages. Here, silence isn't just the absence of sound. It's a physical weight, a constant ringing in the ears that reminds you exactly how infinitesimal the human presence is against this ancient, dusty backdrop. This is the red dirt, a landscape so vast and indifferent that it makes the human soul feel entirely exposed. But beneath the raw, sun-baked beauty of the earth lies a psychological reality known to those who navigate it as the death zone. In the city, a 1% drop in mental clarity might mean a missed email or a forgotten appointment. Out here in the furnace of the interior, that same tiny slip in focus is not just a minor inconvenience, it is a potential fatality. The Outback is a living paradox. It is simultaneously a desolate wasteland and the world's most unforgiving proving ground for the resilient mind. To understand high performance in this context, we must move far beyond the modern corporate definitions we are accustomed to in our daily lives. We aren't discussing productivity hacks, morning routines, or hitting quarterly KPIs. In the extreme isolation of the Australian interior, high performance is stripped down to its most primal, survivalist definition. The ability to maintain precise decision-making under overwhelming biological stress. When the mercury climbs past 45 degrees Celsius, the red dirt begins to perform a sort of psychological surgery on the traveler. It strips away the ego. It peels back the layers of social conditioning and professional status until all that remains is your raw, mental fortitude and your capacity for active problem-solving. To thrive in this environment is to engage in a constant, silent confrontation with your own cognitive limitations and fears. The lessons learned by those who call this place home, the cattle station owners, the bush pilots, and the Indigenous trackers, serve as the ultimate blueprint for staying sharp in any high-pressure environment, whether it be a desert or a boardroom. The cost of entry into this elite mental state is high because the biological tax of the desert is relentless and unforgiving. Our brains are remarkably fragile when removed from the safety of climate-controlled comfort. Scientific observation reveals that the prefrontal cortex, the seat of our logic, planning, and impulse control, is the very first system to falter when the body's internal temperature rises to dangerous levels. As the sun beats down, a phenomenon known as decision fatigue sets in like a heavy physical weight on the shoulders. In a comfortable office, choosing between two strategic paths is a routine task. In the Outback, where every single step burns precious calories and every hour requires a calculated management of water reserves, the simple act of choosing a path or checking a mechanical gauge becomes a monumental mental burden. The human brain is an energy-hungry organ consuming 20% of the body's total energy. However, in the extreme heat, the body undergoes a desperate triage. It redirects that vital energy away from the prefrontal cortex and toward thermoregulation. Your brain effectively starves its own logic centers just to keep your heart beating and your skin sweating. This is the mental trap that claims the unwary and the unprepared. When your cognitive resources dwindle, you begin to take dangerous shortcuts. You misread a topographic map, you underestimate the distance to the next bore, or you ignore the subtle metallic change in your engine's hum. We see this reflected in the tragic history of early European explorers like Burke and Wills, whose mental rigidity and refusal to respect the environment's rules led to their ultimate demise. Yet, despite these lethal stakes, a select group of high performers doesn't just survive. They maintain 100% focus for weeks on end with zero margin for error. How do they harden the mind against these crushing elements? How do they avoid the shimmer of reality and stay grounded when the world seems to be melting? Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. We are about to explore the ancient techniques and modern protocols that turn isolation into a mental sharpener, beginning with the foundations of the most resilient minds to ever walk this earth. To understand how to master the death zone, we must look back at those who navigated the red dirt long before modern technology arrived. The original high performers of this land, the Indigenous Australians, didn't just survive the Outback. They mapped it through a cognitive achievement of staggering complexity known as Songlines. These were not merely stories or myths, but incredibly precise mental maps encoded into rhythm and melody, spanning thousands of miles. By walking a path and singing the corresponding song, a tracker could recall every waterhole, every seasonal change, and every potential danger with surgical precision. This is data management in its purest form, a way of offloading the immense burden of survival onto the rhythmic centers of the brain. Alongside these mental maps is the practice of dadari, a concept of deep, quiet awareness and inner listening. It is a state of extreme situational awareness where the individual becomes a quiet observer of the environment, noticing the tiniest shift in the wind or the behavior of a bird. It is the ultimate antidote to the decision fatigue we discussed earlier, allowing the mind to remain receptive without the constant, exhausting chatter of the ego. Contrast this ancient wisdom with the tragic 1860 expedition of Robert O'Hara, Burke, and William John Wills. These were men of high status and immense ambition, but they lacked mental adaptability. They viewed the outback as an enemy to be conquered through sheer force of will rather than a system to be understood. Their failure wasn't just a lack of supplies, it was a lack of dadiri. They were surrounded by the very resources they needed to survive, but their mental rigidity and refusal to respect the environment's rules blinded them. They could not hear the deep listening because they were too busy shouting at the landscape. This historical contrast proves that in high-pressure environments, the most dangerous thing you can bring with you is a fixed mindset. As the sun climbs higher, the psychological landscape becomes even more treacherous. This is where the shimmer moves from a physical heat haze to a cognitive illusion. When the brain is deprived of diverse stimuli and burdened by heat, it begins to hallucinate or take desperate shortcuts. This mirage effect is a literal breakdown of the prefrontal cortex's ability to verify reality. To counter this, the high performer utilizes a phenomenon often referred to as the third man factor. In moments of extreme isolation and peril, many survivors report a distinct sensation of a presence walking beside them, offering calm advice or helping them make critical decisions. Science suggests this is the brain's way of externalizing its own survival instincts to bypass a frozen or panicked conscious mind. To stay grounded and avoid falling into the trap of these hallucinations, Outback veterans use anchoring techniques. They create rigid physical routines, checking the tightness of a bolt, tapping a specific gauge, or reciting a daily checklist to tether their consciousness to the physical world, refusing to let the shimmer of the desert pull them into a mental void. This reliance on external systems is best exemplified by the Royal Flying Doctor Service. When an RFDS pilot prepares to land a multi-million-dollar aircraft on a remote dusty strip in the middle of a medical crisis, they don't rely on intuition or feeling. They lean on the checklist manifesto. They know that when adrenaline spikes and the brain is under heat stress, internal thinking becomes unreliable. By outsourcing their cognitive load to a physical checklist, they free up their remaining mental energy for the first principles thinking required when things inevitably go wrong. If a mechanical component fails 500 miles from the nearest workshop, they don't panic. They break the problem down to its most basic physical components and use whatever is at hand, the famous fencing wire and duct tape philosophy, to find a solution. Finally, we must consider the transformative power of isolation itself. While many fear the silence of the red dirt, the high performer understands the distinction between loneliness and solitude. Loneliness is the state of lack, but solitude is a period of intense mental training. In the long-term silence of the outback, the brain's ability to process complex patterns is actually heightened. Without the constant interruption of digital notifications or social expectations, the internal engine of the mind becomes more efficient, more focused, and more attuned to the subtle signals of reality. This isn't just about survival. It's about using the vastness of the landscape to rebuild a mind that is sharper, quieter, and more resilient than the one that first stepped off the safe pavement and into the dust. Building on these foundations of isolation and cognitive discipline, we arrive at the three immovable pillars of the Outback mindset. The first is radical self-reliance. In the middle of the red dirt, the realization that no one is coming to save you serves as a powerful psychological catalyst. Instead of triggering paralysis, it activates a state of heightened, active problem-solving. The brain stops scanning the distant horizon for help and begins scanning the immediate environment for utility. This leads directly into the second pillar, resourcefulness over resources. In a world of abundance, we are trained to seek the perfect tool for a specific task. In the Outback, cognitive flexibility is the only currency that matters. This is the philosophy of fencing wire and duct tape, where a cattle station owner sees not just a broken gate, but a dozen different ways to repurpose a scrap of metal to fix a water pump or patch a radiator. It is an exercise in divergent thinking, forcing the mind to see multiple futures and functions for a single object. However, perhaps the most counterintuitive lesson is the third pillar, the slow down rule. Modern high-performance culture often celebrates the hustle. The idea that speed is synonymous with success and that constant motion is a sign of productivity. But in the bush, speed is often a precursor to a fatal mistake. When a crisis strikes, a sudden dust storm, a medical emergency, or a mechanical failure, the veteran performer does the exact opposite of what instinct dictates. They stop, they sit down, they might even boil a billy of tea on a small fire. This forced pause is a biological reset. By refusing to move until the initial spike of cortisol and adrenaline has subsided, they ensure that the prefrontal cortex, rather than the primal amygdala, is steering the ship. This prevents reactive decision-making when the stakes are highest and the margin for error is non-existent. These lessons from the desert are not confined to the geographic extremes of Australia. They are blueprints for navigating the complexities of modern life. We can translate the physical heat stress of the desert directly into the digital burnout of our professional lives. Just as the brain redirects energy from thinking to cooling in extreme heat, our constant exposure to notifications and high-stakes deadlines siphons off the cognitive fuel needed for deep work. To combat this, we must implement the Outback pause in our daily routines. Taking a 10-second mental reset before responding to a hostile email or making a critical business decision allows the shimmer of emotional reactivity to fade, revealing the objective path forward. Furthermore, we must intentionally seek out low-stimulus training. By occasionally embracing silence and the perceived boredom of a world without screens, we strengthen the brain's internal engine, making it less dependent on external dopamine hits and more capable of sustained focus in any environment. Ultimately, the Outback serves as the great leveler. It teaches us that high performance is not an elusive state of perfection, but a gritty process of recovery from inevitable mistakes. Even the most experienced trackers will occasionally lose a trail. The difference lies in how quickly they acknowledge the error and recalibrate. This resilience is bolstered by the uniquely Australian concept of mateship. Even in the most isolated cattle stations where humans are few and far between, the mental health of the collective is paramount. Mateship is the invisible mental safety net, a recognition that while self-reliance is a pillar, no mind can survive the vastness entirely alone. It is the understanding that checking in on your neighbor is as vital to survival as checking the water levels in your own tanks. As we reflect on these lessons, it becomes clear that our modern, comfortable world often makes our minds soft by removing the friction of survival. We have optimized for convenience, but in doing so, we have atrophied the very muscles required for true resilience. I challenge you to find your own Outback, a place of discomfort, a period of isolation, or a task that requires radical resourcefulness to test and sharpen your mental edge. Staying sharp isn't about being the smartest person in the room or having the most resources at your disposal. It is about being the person most capable of surviving the shimmer of reality without losing focus, standing firm in the red dust of your own challenges, and finding the clarity that only the deep silence can provide. Performance is simply the art of staying present when everything else is pushing